Good morning, everyone. My name is Tina Shankul, and I'm a policy analyst with OFA. I will be moderating the session on the Phosphorus Reduction Collaborative. So without any further ado, I am pleased to introduce Mr. Charles Lalonde. Mr. Lalonde is a project consultant with CJ Agron Consulting. As a consultant since 2007, Charlie has been delivering many water-related farm projects for several farm organizations, and today he will be discussing the phosphorus reduction collaboration from his role as the project manager. Good morning, Charlie, and thank you for joining us.
Okay, we're all set to go. So I'd like to thank the OFA and the organizers for placing me on the agenda today. I'm going to give you an overview of our projects so that you have a sense of what we've done in terms of phosphorus reduction in the Lake Erie Basin. So the agenda. So this is about the Lake Erie Basin. We're going to start there. We're going to talk about the PRC and the Thames River. Then we're going to talk about the projects, and there's several of them, and then a little bit about the next steps. So before we start, Lake Erie is a difficult lake. It's this one here on the slide. And the depth of the lake is extremely shallow in the Western Basin. And when you compare it to Lake Ontario, Lake Superior, Michigan, where you can see a lot of color, it means it has a lot of depth. So Lake Erie is shallow in the area where a lot of the agricultural waters flow into. And it's not surprising that part of the basin has a major issue. So let's begin with some of the bad news. This was an article on the web in March of this year by the University of Michigan. The headline, The Discovery of the Dead Zone. And the article goes on to describe how dead zones begin with nutrients, especially phosphorus, and from agricultural runoff. And as the waters get into the rivers, we end up with an algae problem. And we all know phosphorus fertilizes algae. So the dead zone occurs when oxygen is gone. So it releases natural phosphorus from the sediment at the bottom of the lake, and it just propels the expansion of the dead zone. Phosphorus that is bound to soil particles can travel through our rivers, and only 20% of that phosphorus is immediately available as it enters the rivers and the lake. However, once the oxygen is depleted, 90% of that phosphorus on the bottom of the lake becomes immediately available. And that's what fuels the algae blooms. This is another article. It appeared in January 21st of this year. And it's by a Ohio field leader for the Ohio Soybean Council. And the interesting thing here is the work being done in agriculture in Ohio is sponsored through a soybean checkup. And the article, in my opinion, for the first time, links nitrogen as a direct cause to the size of the algae blooms and making them more toxic. So the harmful algae bloom is not just a phosphorus management issue, but both one with phosphorus and nitrogen. A lot of our efforts in the past have focused exclusively on phosphorus. So we added this article in January talking about nitrogen, and 10 days ago, there's another article that appears, and this time is from the University of Vermont, where to fix nitrogen pollution in the US. So as you can see, the red zones are plentiful. And for us, at the tip of Lake Erie, the Maumee River, which is well known for its phosphorus contributions to Lake Erie, is also a nitrogen zone that has been identified. So as we move forward, we can expect more attention to all of the fertilizers. Dr. Winslow is also with the Ohio Soybean Council. Was describing in another article the nutrient sources that affect Lake Erie, and he's got them broken down into 3 buckets. The first one is runoff from the land, so that's phosphorus and other nutrients tied to the soil particles, and managing soil erosion becomes important. The second bucket comes from current fertilizer use and nutrients, manures being applied on our fields. These have been managed so far through various best management practices. We've done soil testing, we continue to promote it, variable rate fertilizer applications, and we've got an active for our management program. And the third bucket is the legacy phosphorus that we find at the bottom of Lake Erie, where it has a supply of phosphorus and other nutrients available. And as the article continued, he highlighted the concern of many in agriculture about legacy phosphorus. Is that our primary cause for the algae blooms? Well, their studies indicate that somewhere between 3 and 7% of the phosphorus is coming from the bottom of the lake itself. So it does contribute. The other point I would make here, when you look at their estimate, 3 versus 7% shows to the imprecise nature of doing these kinds of estimates. But taking a 20,000 foot view, it is a minor component. And we're all familiar with drinking water crisis that occurred in the past in Toledo. And water had to be brought into a city of 400,000 people. These images, as well as images of algae blooms on the lake, make their way around the world, and they do tarnish our international reputation as being excellent stewards of the world's largest freshwater body. So as a result of Toledo, we've seen a raft of reports coming out and addressing both point source. And point source is simply your source of phosphorus being released is contained in the structure. So, for example, a municipal sewage treatment plant would release phosphorus in their used water. Whereas non-point source contributions is really where agriculture takes place on the fields, and that becomes an area where we in agriculture need to address. So through these reports, we had the Canada Ontario Lake Erie Action Plan calling for a 40% reduction in phosphorus loads. And the report also identified key watersheds like the Thames River, Maumee River in Ohio, for an additional reduction of 40% in soluble phosphorus. So not only do we have a target for phosphorus primarily associated with erosion issues surface, but we have a 40% target for dissolved phosphorus being delivered through the agricultural drainage systems. So one of the questions we have is this really achievable by 2025? The goal was set in 2018, and we weren't given many tools to deal with it. So the question is out there. And the problems continue. So what you have on the left side is satellite image showing the impairment, and on the right-hand side is a visual view of what can happen in the summertime. So we know that agriculture is a major contributor, but also phosphorus is an essential plant nutrient. So we have a balancing act how we can keep the phosphorus on our lands, and how do we handle any leakage from our cropping systems. So that brought us together for in the Thames River to address the issues. The Thames River is extremely long from the headwaters to the mouth of Lake St. Clair, and the corridor to Lake Erie is obvious through the Detroit River. The basin has intensive agriculture, and it has several cities, Chatham, London, Woodstock, and a few others. And the landscape varies, as well as the soil types, as well as the drainage systems. So it becomes an ideal place to study how can we intervene in the drainage systems to remove phosphorus. So in these pictures, you're looking at the Thames River on the right-hand side when we had an algae bloom a few years ago. And the picture on the left is a pump station. There's about 120 pump stations in Chatham, Kent. And it creates opportunities or points where we might be able to intervene. So when the OFA decided to co-lead with the city's initiative, that work began in 2016. At the time, we knew we had to address issues. The cities were prepared to work with us. Water is a shared resource as well as a shared responsibility. So cities had interest to support fisheries, support recreation, sources of water, and we, of course, from the agricultural side, wanted to be coming forward on how to best manage our runoff issues associated with phosphorus. So we formed a very broad partnership that came together to discuss the issues and to sort out what the Thames River projects could look like. As you can see from this list, our discussions were quite open. We had many farm organizations, the cities of Chatham and London. We had the First Nation, the Chippewas, the Thames, located in Melbourne, environmental groups, the drainage sector, fertilizer, conservation authorities, and government officials. And we had transparency in our discussions. So it led to a formidable group to start addressing how we can intervene. We also received generous funding, and I'd like to thank all of the organizations that provided some funding towards these projects. And of course, we had funding from Canada through Environment and Climate Change Canada, and from Ontario. And the funding was for projects between 2019 and 2022. So we are currently entering the last year of our projects. So what was our history in trying to deal with phosphorus? And it started way before the Thames River projects. So we looked at BMPs to prevent phosphorus from leaving fields. We also were aware that there's small leakage of nutrients on a per acre basis from ag lands through infiltration and surface runoff. And when you consider the millions of acres, it adds to a lot of phosphorus. So the projects focused on answering one question. Is it possible to remove phosphorus from watercourses and drainage systems after it has already entered? It's always best to deal with problems at source, but our projects were coming after the fact. The phosphorus is already in the water and on its way to Lake Erie. So through these projects, we learned a lot. First of all, the tile water phosphorus concentrations are very, very low. We're talking about 1 part per million or less. And when you're thinking of a 0.03 part per million, we're essentially working at times at the detection limits of the laboratories. Nevertheless, we needed to test our different technologies in this kind of environment. We also learned that the active transfer season from ag lands to the water courses occur from November to May as field tile flows during that period. And it's the dead season, winter, freeze thaw, and as well as snow melt. The summer hydrology in Ontario is quite different from the US because we don't get a lot of rainfall and the plants pull the water upwards and our tiles do stop operating at some point in late May, early June. And in the summer, we can get some very unusual rain events dropping several inches of water in the storm on a very small geographical area, and that can get our tiles flowing for a short period of time. So if we want to look at the particulate phosphorus, so the total phosphorus capture strategy needs to be primarily with surface flows, while drainage water contains the dissolved phosphorus. Some of our learnings is that the technologies working at the tile level were hampered by the water turbidity. And that made several technologies fail. We also know that we have erosion control BMPs, and we also know that in some severe circumstances, erosion control structures have failed. So when you compare what we're doing in the drainage system with what's happening with manure, where the phosphorus concentration in the manure is 50 parts per million or higher, and at times it can be as high as 100 parts per million. The way technologies can work in that environment will be totally different from the technologies that we were testing in the tile waters. So just a brief overview. Start at the bottom left-hand corner. This is a absorbent material that we've tested, and the material was put in the inner circle of the Hickenbottom, so the brown circle, and it was protected with wood chips. And the idea is that in the smaller areas, the absorbent materials would capture the phosphorus before exiting through the Hickenbottom. In the middle picture, we had a project, and you can see the two cement structures plus a monitoring station by the solar panel. This was looking at tile water coming out of a very, very flat field. And at the bottom of that picture, you also see the ability to exercise controlled drainage. On the right-hand side, it's a picture of an installation that took place in Oxford County, looking at moving water through upright structures that contain sorbent material to remove phosphorus. Few more pictures. The work that we did in order to measure phosphorus required a lot of engineering, and we had to install tanks to get to a place where we can accurately measure what was happening. So this is a project in Chatham at Louis Roche's farm. The middle picture was just what's happening inside the tank, and the top left is a biochar picture, and we tested biochar as well. On the bottom left, this is an engineered drain inlet in the middle of farmer's field. As you can see, it's arranged so that it can handle a lot more water. And that water flows directly into an underground municipal drain that eventually makes it to the Thames River. So in these circumstances, you're transferring surface water directly into the tile water. So in one of the projects, we installed a cover on that drain opportunity, And the two orange Hickenbottoms are there as safety valve if there was too much water. And the majority of the water drained through five bluish structured that were designed to contain approximately 20 pounds of absorbent material. So it created an opportunity to remove phosphorus as that water was going through that structure. And the picture on the right is a typical Hickenbottom in the field that has been tilled. So these represent opportunities to intercept phosphorus in the environment. So looking very briefly at the preferential flow issue. And in this case, you will see in the top part of the picture, two orange dots, which was the location of two Hickenbottoms. And the red dot was the structured drain that you saw in the previous picture. And the light blue is the contributing water area to each of those drains for the Hickenbottoms, and the dark blue for the structured inlet. So in this case, there was different elevations in the field, and even though we thought we could visually look at what the contributing areas were, we were fooled because the area that contributed to the inlet was much larger once we had the LiDAR data to analyze the surface areas. So in all of this work with water coming off farms, soil types matter, and clay behave differently than loams. With clay, you have transfer opportunities when the soil is very dry, whereas with loams, it's the opposite. When you have wet conditions, nutrients escape. So some of the BMPs we need to manage phosphorus transport in the fields are quite different. If you've got large macropores with clay, you're going to need some tillage before you apply nutrients. If you're going to apply nutrients, it's ideal to apply manure on green living crops. It could be hay between hay crops, or it can be with cover crops. And of course, there will be times where you got to store longer. Whereas with loams, the risks are entirely different. And you need better weather forecasting and consider pre-planting incorporation so that the manure is placed directly into the soil, and the same goes for commercial fertilizers. So here's some of the other projects that have been tried. So on the top left-hand side, you've got frost seeding in March to start a crop before the heavy runoff period. In the middle top, you have cover crop growing after a corn stalk harvest. And on the right, you've got strip tillage. And the small insert in the center is controlled drainage. And on the bottom left-hand corner, leaving residue on the surface also works for no-till planting. So farmers have been innovative, but we still lose some phosphorus. So this slide is simply to highlight a few things to you. We had 4 Higginbottom locations, and I want you to focus on the immediate exposure, and these are weeks per year. So in one project site, water flowed for 2.6 weeks per year. So you had about 18, 19 days of water flow. At the other locations, given the weather patterns, we only had 6 to really 4 to 6 days of water flow. And these have big impacts as we're doing these projects, because obviously where it was drought conditions, it prevents us from getting results. So all of this to say that before we look at financial figures on these things, we're going to have to put together our 3 to 4 years worth of data to arrive with some meaningful estimates. And that's a job at hand for this coming year. Very briefly, we also look at different forms of tanks so that we could absorbent material in place to intercept tile water. This is a tank that's at the Chippewa site. It works quite well, and we've changed our materials 3 times in that tank. We've got larger projects that were of interest to the cities, and we're pumping water, the picture on the left-hand side, at a pump station in Chatham, directly in a container. And on the right-hand side, it's container pumping water from the Medway Creek. And back to the Chatham pumping station, Waterloo biofilter, pumped 40,000 liters of water a day and put it through a container. And so the lessons learned here is the physical constraints of the equipment limits the amount of water. In the process of this trial, which is now completed, they've collected data to be able to design a system to receive 100,000 liters per day. And by the way, all of these presentations from the different technologies are on our website. But we still have a lot of things we don't know. And this deals with the surface flows on flatlands. We need to do more LiDAR analysis. We don't know how long these sorbent materials can last and how they'll get serviced, and whether farmers can service their own installations. We're going to pass judgment on that later this year. The animal nutrient impacts is really event-based, and it's hard to program or factor in. And how to identify hotspots where we should have projects in the landscape, that still evades us. And of course, scaling up to the entire watershed, what's the cost of doing that versus the impact on Lake Erie? So this slide, I share it with you because the government priorities have been about everything except phosphorus, which in its way, it's fine. It's addressing societal concerns, but we have a phosphorus problem. And we need to start thinking, how can farmers access meaningful incentives so that phosphorus BMPs can be put in place? rather than going through indirect programs to address phosphorus. And our next steps are quite obvious. Do we need more BMPs? Do we have drainage tools? Do we need a combination of both? And we need many more years of learnings before we're confident that we have the tools to do the job. So I'd like to thank you for listening in. I'd like to thank both co-chairs of the Thames River Phosphorus Reduction Collaborative, Mark Reeser from the OFA, and Claire Latimer from the city of Chatham, Kent, who have done many international presentations in the past year promoting the work that we're doing on the Thames River. So thank you, and it's time for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lalonde, for your excellent presentation. As a reminder to our attendees, please submit your questions on this presentation in the questions panel in the control panel. I will check if we have any questions coming in. No questions yet, so just a reminder, questions into the question panel. Charlie, I'll start one off. Were there any surprises coming out of the project from what you anticipated when going in?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There was a tremendous gap between what technology companies were claiming to what a reality was on the edge of the field. And when we talked to these companies, they were all saying the amount of phosphorus in the water is so low, our technology is having a hard time reacting with the water to remove the phosphorus. But I think we have to persist working at that level because it is non-point source. And we have millions of acres that contribute to it. So we need to find those opportunities. And once we can find the best of materials, we know we can work on the surface, pick and bottoms, at engineered inlets. We can work in tiled drains themselves to intercept water.
Great, thank you. We'll just wait a few more minutes. Again, I'm not seeing any questions come in, but if anyone does have questions, oh, here we go. We do have one came in. Why can't municipalities be more responsible for the leaching that comes out of landfills? Most of them are situated in ravines and near water sources like creeks and rivers.
Well, the point I would make here is the municipalities' landfill sites are under control, they're under regulatory controls, so that they have to meet a standard. You might argue you don't like the standard, but it's there. It's the same thing with sewage treatment plants. They have a standard that was lowered in terms of the water quality for what's coming out of those plants. So everybody is doing its part. What we hope, and it's an excellent question, because if the municipality has a landfill issue, containers like we've developed for the Medway test, as well as the Chatham Kent test, can be installed and they can remove phosphorus from those waters on 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. So there's solutions for everything. And that would fall more into a point source situation, which is easier because there would also be infrastructure in the sense that electricity is readily available, and oversight of that kind of project would be a lot easier.
Thank you, Charlie. We have a couple other questions. Thanks, Charlie, for the update. Do we have any new numbers on the phosphorus levels in Lake Erie? Do we know if there have been any reductions in the past 5-6 years since they've been working on it?
That is an extremely difficult question to answer because we've had violent storms in Lake Erie, tremendous waves, turbulence, mixing water from the eastern Lake Erie Basin to the western basin. It is it's a moving target, and I don't have an estimate for it. Our best gauge is the satellite images that come out monthly showing the impairment in the lake. We know that it doesn't take a lot of phosphorus to trigger algae blooms. So the problem is quite complex and severe once you have the source of phosphorus. But I don't know in per million what an average figure could be.
Great. And are there many farm sites implementing controlled drainage in the near future that you know of or that you foresee?
I don't have statistics on that. From our discussions with the drainage contractors, they're comfortable implementing controlled drainage in different scenarios. If you go back 5-10 years ago, the big concern was will it blow my tiles? So there was a lot of caution moving towards that. So as we see more of these structures appearing in the landscape, it's giving both farmers and the contractors some confidence on how they can be used. But I don't think I had to guess we're probably at less than 100,000 acres of coverage at this time.